All right. Very cool. We are live. Nice. Welcome to the podcast.
Welcome.
Today we have Brendan Coolsaet with us. He's an associate professor at the European School of Political and Social Sciences, ESPOL, in France. Also a member of the Global Environmental Justice Group at the University of East Anglia. He has written words in Reuters, Le Monde, Politico, Le Soir, and others. Brendan, I think, self-describes an environmental social scientist who works at the intersection of environmental justice, environmental humanities, and critical food studies. He has also authored a key textbook called Environmental Justice, the first of its kind to offer a comprehensive and accessible overview of the field of environmental justice. Brendan, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Hi guys, thanks for having me. How you doing?
Very good, very good. It's well, for those of us watching, this is our fourth or fifth stream, so we're getting in the hang of things now. We were just saying to Brendan that we know for now the stream looks a little bit ugly with just the zoom, but we're gonna
It's rustic. It's fine.
It's rustic, yeah. we're gonna work a little bit on the aesthetic. Because as they say,
It's
optics is
authentic.
everything. So yeah, Brendan, you've I just want to like get before we talk about the more academic things and the kind of deeper more complex topics and stuff. Maybe we can start with something that you did a bit more recently, which is that you went on quite the road trip.
That's right.
Took a few months off. I think 6, you said, or 8, something like that.
That's right.
Yeah. And yeah. So, how was Italy, and what exactly were you researching or looking at when not sampling the all superior Italian food, as I have to say, because my girlfriend will kill me if I don't?
I did a lot of that, to be honest. Also, because part of the trip was just getting to know Italy. Not that we didn't know Italy, because my partner is also from Italy. Well, her family, she's Belgian Italian, but most of her family is in Italy, which is obviously nice, but also sort of creates this attraction to one part of Italy when you go there, because you have to sort of visit the family, right? Mm-hmm. And we didn't really know the rest of Italy that much. So the idea was to basically travel around outside of the cities. We didn't want to go to the big cities, most of which we had seen. We wanted to see a bit of rural Italy in a way. And we wanted to take the kid, who was now 3 years old and was going to start school soon. And so it was a bit the right moment to take a bit of a sabbatical leave, parental leave, and also it's something that is possible in France and in Belgium, where we both work. I mean, it's made accessible, it's financially supported, so that's very helpful. And yeah, it wasn't I wasn't doing field work per se, but obviously some of the things I've seen and some of the places I went to were close to some of the things I've worked on, obviously, as a scholar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just want to see if it's possible for me to add an image on here, because I I saved the image of your trip that you took, and it's impressive. Like you went through a lot of places. Let me see if this is very hard to do. Okay, I'll just do a screen capture.
It looks impressive, but I mean, we weren't, jumping around from one place to the other. It was actually pretty slow traveling. We had a small van in which we traveled, and then we stayed on farms here and there when we had the opportunity.
But yeah, I have the picture on the screen right now. Yeah, it looks like it must have been an absolutely amazing trip. I mean, like from all the way from Milan to San Marino, passing by Bologna. I mean, Syracuse, Marsala. Like, you guys seem to have gone kind of done the whole boot and back, really.
Yeah,
That's
pretty much,
awesome.
pretty much. Yeah.
Um, so in one of the threads that you posted, you talked about the I mean, I know that you didn't, like you said, you didn't do it specifically for research, like you weren't sent there or anything, but you did kind of take your time there to study up on some of the stuff that's happening around the farms and countryside in Italy. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found, what you discovered?
Yeah. I mean, part of the trip was really about working in farms, and you know, we're always talking about this Italian food and how good it is and whatnot. But we had very little knowledge of, you know, the sort of production side of Italian food, you know. And my partner's family comes from Puglia, and Puglia is very well known for the olive production, right? The olive oil. It has, I think, it has more olive trees than it has inhabitants. Just, you know, to give you an idea of the magnitude of the thing. And the olive harvest happens in November. And November is kind of the worst time of the year to take holidays, right? It's with school, it's impossible. When you work at university like I do, you know, it's you can't just, you know, leave your students. So we never had the chance to sort of go and do the olive harvest. So that was one of the things that we wanted to do. And then, you know, we did a whole lot of other things, a whole lot of different cultures, of course, a whole lot of, I mean, in the north, we did a lot of market gardening in the mountains. In September, we went to do the grape harvest in Tuscany, which is also one of these classics, right? A lot of people do this during their holidays, you know, especially American tourists. It's very famous for American
Really?
tourists to do this. And so the network we used is, you guys may know this, is the woofing network, right? I
Yeah.
think that originated in the US, I think. And that is, you know, it's a particular type of farming, right? It's small farms, it's organic farms, and by its very nature, you know, these farms are a bit outside of the sort of mainstream production context, you could say, of food. And that is one of the things that struck me very quickly, is that you had, despite the sort of diversity of farms and the different realities and the different objectives, you know, some people were doing that as a living, where other people were doing that more, you know, as a side gig. But you had to sort of shared objectives that were environmental and farm related. You know, people try to farm with nature instead of against nature, to put it, if we can put it like that. But also very sort of political objectives, and trying to, you know, question the sort of hegemonic farming institutions that you have all over Europe, and, you know, that characterize this sort of post-war farming context in Europe that is, you know, geared towards production, overproduction, and less towards, you know, well-being of farmers and, you know, conserving the environment and whatnot. And that's very strong with these types of farms. Yeah, I have plenty of stories around that, but yeah.
And this context, even though like Italy, I think, is like in mid to high tables for level of organic growth of vegetables and such, right? So did you feel like there was this clash of the kind of productivist mindset within the age categories as well, or is it something that kind of transcends age, the struggle between like being productive versus having good produce?
Not age, not related to age, I would say. I mean, I've seen, I mean, you had very sort of young farmers, new farmers, in a way that, you know, left the cities and started something new, whereas you had, you know, the sort of old back to the lands movement, people that started somewhere in the 60s and 70s, and had some of the same objective that you see today with people leaving the cities. That didn't struck me really, but what did strike me was a bit of a paradox, is that it's really hard to find organic produce in Italy, in markets, in supermarkets, despite the fact that you have this obsession of Italians with their food, and despite the fact that apparently, and I didn't know that before leaving, but Italy is the largest network of farmers markets in the world. So despite these two elements, we had difficulty in finding organic milk, for example, for the kid. We're not obsessed with eating organic. If we don't find it, we don't find it. But for the kid, we're trying to give her the best produce we can find, especially when you drink a lot of milk during the day. You want to make sure it's not full of pesticides, right? Yeah. And yet we had a hard time finding organic milk, even in the sort of big supermarket brands. And the reason we found out later on is that most of the organic produce in Italy is actually exported. And when you think of it, go to the supermarket in Belgium or in France, and a lot of that comes from Italy.
Yeah.
And that's why
exported to Europe.
Yeah, exported in Europe, in Northern Europe, especially, and so you have this sort of paradox where you have all this talk about food, and all this talk about local food, because local food is very important for Italians. You have this concept of chilometro zero, so the very local food market. But at the same time, the organic element is fairly absent from that. So that was a bit of a paradox for us. That was a bit of a shock, to be honest.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of the people that you met also were struggling with the firsthand effects of climate change. Because I remember in your thread, you were talking about how why am I forgetting the English word? Récolte. What do you call it? Like the crop yields were much lower, and the
Harvest.
temperatures had harvest. Thank you. The crop yields were lower. The harvests had come later. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to lead to is that you must have seen firsthand the real world examples of this environmental justice topics that you study and that you write about in these little Italian farms that were finding themselves having to deal with the same system, but with changing factors of weather and what their farms were yielding, etc. Did you see a little bit, like, I guess I wonder how it must have felt as a researcher to see what you study in practice in front of your eyes?
Yeah, I mean, that was very present. But I mean, I've seen it in other places too. But you could say in a way that these sort of alternative farming communities are a bit part of the frontline communities in our countries, right? And in the sense, yeah, they do face an injustice in the sense that they're the ones probably doing the most effort in trying to steer agriculture away from from its bad habits and from what's not working, and from its sort of impact on the environment, its most extreme impact on the environment. And at the same time, there are also the communities that probably struggle the most within the farming community to adapt to the effects of climate change. Mm-hmm. They're not of massive amounts of financial means, and so they're probably struggling to adapt their whole system to how unpredictable the weather is becoming, right? Because that's their main their main challenge is basically dealing with the fact that everything becomes pretty unpredictable. That and the fact that the seasons are completely changing, right?
I think we're slightly losing Brendan. We'll just have to wait just a few seconds. First it was Jamie, then it was Brendan. Everybody's having
Cast on the
internet
curse.
problems. Yeah.
You'll have it next.
Oh no, please. Oh, there you go. He's
Oh.
back. Yeah, hey.
I'm back.
Jamie was saying he's passed the curse on to you.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No, it's all right. Sorry, we didn't really hear the last 10 seconds ish. I don't know if you want to
Yeah.
summarize.
So I was picking up on your question on whether they're facing environmental injustices, and in a way you could say that, in the sense that they're doing most of the efforts in trying to steer agriculture away from its environmental impact, while at the same time, having less means to adapt to the consequences of climate change. So you could say that, but I mean it's been pretty rough for them this year, especially in southern Italy. I mean, Sicily broke a heat record, a European heat record with 48 degrees Celsius, something like that. I mean, that and the combination with late frosts in April and lack of rain in some places and too much rain in other places. The vineyard we worked with in Tuscany, when we were there in September, hadn't seen rain since the month of May or something. They hadn't had rain in like 4 months.
Wow. Okay.
So imagine the kind of impact that it has on your grapes, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been pretty. I mean, for them, it's been pretty tough. A pretty tough year. Most of them actually lost a lot of harvest. Again, the vineyard, said they had about half of their production this year of what they normally have, due to the changing weather patterns.
Yeah.
Do you think it is this first-hand experience of the effects of climate change that has sort of made these farmers want to actually do something about it, to, as you said, steer their sort of practices in a more environmentally friendly direction, or did they become more aware in sort of a more indirect manner, or both?
I think it's two things. It's the environmental aspect, definitely, but in my view, it's a political dimension as well that is very strong. Their actions that could be framed as environmental actions or farming actions carry this political frame that is, I think, one of the main drivers of what they do. It's not just about adapting to climate change. It's not just about finding the best farming practices. It's also about reconnecting to the land. It's about through farming finding a way to have a voice in local policymaking around land use, for example. It's about shifting your income from something that is unsustainable in both, the financial and the environmental sense of the word, to something that is much more stable. And it's definitely about building community, even though that doesn't always, work out like they would be, and it's probably the hardest part of their job. But it's definitely about finding, building community around farming and around food. Yeah.
Is it sort of a successful project, like actually getting together as a group in order to put pressure on this, or do they kind of face internal struggles with that sort of organizational challenge?
Oh, they're facing loads of struggles related to, I mean, egos and
Yeah.
organizing collectively. Also, Italy has this peculiar history of farming unions that were very, very big in Italy. And over the time sort of turned into these sort of big agro corporations that are mostly about, making money with farming, and not about, the initial ideas of, collective ownership and whatnot.
That's the same institution sort of that's developed into that.
Yeah.
That's
And so
interesting.
this collective history sort of, I think has left marks within the farming communities, and sort of they're wary of these, this history repeating in some way. At least that's what I've heard from a couple of people, that they were saying, look at the union. We don't want to end up like they ended up. It's all about money. There's no farming there anymore. So that history is very alive still in Italy.
And I guess a lot of the money that comes in is subsidy money, in terms of like EU subsidies, right? Because I remember when Brexit was happening, one of the main arguments against Brexit from farmers was that they receive a shit ton of money from the EU to keep land for pasturing and things like that, environmental subsidies. So I guess there's a lot of money in that sense as well, not just in the actual farming, like selling the produce. I this Italy trip is honestly like super interesting. I really love that you did it, but I know that we don't have forever on time, and I do really want to talk to you about your main work, which is
Let's do it.
On this very we can come back to the Italy stuff in a bit as well. But I would just be remiss if I didn't mention this very interesting term, which is environmental justice. So I thought maybe we could start with what actually environmental justice is, because many people say it has become empty of meaning from being overused, often in completely incorrectly. But in some ways, I think we can see all over the world that this word, these words, environmental justice, hold a lot of potential and power as a rallying term across the world. People are in the streets from Brussels to Rio to, shouting about environmental justice. And sure, maybe a lot of them wouldn't be able to define what that term would really mean for them, or maybe they would have completely different definitions. But this is something that you personally study and that you write about. So maybe we should get this stuff from what do you say, from the horse's mouth? No.
Wow.
Is that what you say? No. What's
No, it is.
Okay, yeah. I was thinking, wait, is that an insult? Am I accidentally insulting our guest? No, just maybe we should get it from an expert. What actually is environmental justice?
So there's different ways of defining it, obviously. I think the most sort of straightforward way would be to say that environmental justice is about the unequal distribution of environmental costs and benefits. And the study of that, so let's call it environmental justice studies or analysis, tries to understand both how this distribution sort of takes place, but also the sort of underlying drivers of that distribution, right? And I'm saying that's the more straightforward way, because there's been a lot of work to sort of depart a bit from an approach that is a bit too distributive, a bit too about distribution cost and benefit. A lot of others are going to say, well, it's not just about distribution, it's about a whole lot of other things, including cultural aspects, racial aspects, the economy, matters of cultural recognition, matters of participation, who sits at the table and who decides about how things are being distributed, that sort of things, right? But of course, that definition wouldn't be complete if we didn't talk about the movement, right? what I do is environmental justice studies, right? But environmental justice originally sort of comes from a very interesting movement in the US originally, in the 70s and 80s, that within the civil rights movement is sort of starting to look at how the toxic pollution is spatially distributed, and how this toxic pollution happens to disproportionately sit within African American communities, or more generally within racial minorities, in which the African American community is going to be very represented. So basically, landfills happen to be more located within African American neighborhoods than they are within white neighborhoods, to put it very simply, right? And this is true not just for landfills. This is true for all sorts of toxic facilities, waste treatment, other sort of industrial sites, and then it also sort of, as a sort of mirror in a way, can be traced within, health-related environmental inequalities. You're going to see that, a lot of health-related inequalities are concentrated within what is called the sort of black belt in the southern US, right? And you're going to have a very strong overlap between the presence of African American communities and a whole sort of environmental impacts, a whole sort of health-related impacts and whatnot. So that's the very origin of environmental justice. And actually, at the beginning, they rather talked about environmental racism, right? The race element was very present, and then they sort of broadened that up to environmental justice once additional evidence came in, showing that obviously race is a very important element of it. You're in the US, a very sort of peculiar racial history, but low-income communities are also going to face this sort of unequal distribution of environmental burdens. And so it's going to be a combination of things. You could, in a way, you could say that the environmental justice movement is a sort of intersectional movement avant la lettre, in a way, right? Before this thing intersectionality was even a thing, you had the environmental justice movement that was basically combining a whole set of different movements around this issue of environmental inequalities.
Yeah, and like you said, the US context is quite unique. So for it to originate there, it kind of makes sense that as it broadened and as it traveled, it also changed into like something slightly different in Europe, for example, or around the global south and other places. One of the things that you speak about that I find quite interesting is this idea of decolonizing environmental justice, or decolonial environmental justice. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So as you said, the environmental justice framework has traveled a lot since then, right? I mean, the first sort of generation environmental justice study was really about documenting this sort of spatial inequalities, right? And then second generation environmental justice studies have sort of departed from the original political and geographic boundaries of environmental justice to apply it in different places to different people in different contexts and whatnot. And there's been quite some work on that. What we noted is that there was indeed a sort of conceptual transfer and an empirical transfer of this concept to other places in the world, but mostly it stayed, at least conceptually, a sort of North American thing, right? Or at least a Western thing, because part of the concepts are now developing in Europe. And at the same time, the sort of empirical application of these studies were increasingly done within the global South. And so you had a potential tension there between the place where the concepts originate and the place where they're applied, which we argued was at risk of creating new forms of injustices, forms of knowledge-related injustices, epistemic injustices, if I can call it like that. And so we in a paper we published a few years ago with a colleague, we looked at what the effects were of that transfer. So what happens when you take a concept originating within that peculiar context of West and start applying it somewhere else? What kind of effects do you have, political and conceptual effects do you have in doing that? One of the things, for example, is that we showed that this focus on distribution that I mentioned earlier was going to generate a set of different problems, and this has been the focus, like I said, it's been the focus of quite some research within the environmental justice literature. But we argued that the decolonial approach was going to shine a new light on that, in the sense that it was going to get us into a discussion on different worldviews on the environment. If you, and I'm going to simplify this to the bone, but I mean, people that are interested can always email me for the article. But if you apply that, if you apply a sort of distributive approach in which you're basically arguing that you can offset environmental inequalities by distributing it in a more equal or in a fairer way, you're going to have a problem when you have cases in which a pluralist approach is not really possible. What I mean by that is that you're going to have places where the very idea of distribution is incompatible with the local worldview. For example, a very vocal and very explicit example is the movement in Standing Rock a few years back. So you had a U-flat movement in Standing Rock that occupied a land where a pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline, was supposed to be organized. The problem in Standing Rock wasn't about distributing smaller pipelines equally or fairly distributing pipelines across the country, right? It was about not having pipelines at all, because the pipeline was a risk to the kinship that the community was sharing with the land, right? It was a risk to the rights of that the community, the right to water, not for the community, but for the water itself, right? And so in this is a very good example of how you can't just, distribute the environmental impact of that pipeline, because that would have implied that you can sort of objectify water, chop it into small pieces, and then basically distribute it over those communities that are considered to have a right to that water, which doesn't work in this case, right? And these are the sort of issues you get into when you're applying this environmental justice framework in different contexts. Now, we're not saying that we shouldn't be doing that, right? I think the environmental justice framework is very powerful to sort of help us analyze these sort of problems in different contexts. But we have to sort of be aware we ourselves as scholars have to be aware of the effects of using a concept in a different context when we do so.
Yeah, and yeah, going beyond just a purely distributive paradigm, I think is the right way. And I suppose, as you said, just sometimes it can result in imposing a single group's like method of valuing what's at stake upon the others. When I looked at your sort of research overview, I was really interested to find that you're drawing upon Nancy Freya's work. And as we've been talking, I've been kind of understanding more and more like how that all fits in. I'm familiar with her based on her concept of subaltern counterpublics, and I'm really curious to sort of see how exactly, you know, discursive power, I suppose, plays into the context you're researching. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't really developed the counter public part of her work, but yeah, I mean you know, part of Fraser's work starts off with a critique of sort of Habermas, right? Of a context in which you would sort of have an ideal discussion forum in which you could solve a whole set of issues as long as these sort of conditions of communications are met, right? And Fraser is going to say, well, okay, that's very nice, but you have a whole set of institutionalized conditions that are going to prevent this. And Fraser, of course, you know, thinks of women in this case, where she's going to say society is full of these institutionalized rules around the situation of women that keep them from participating in these ideal conditions, right? One of the examples she uses a lot is this idea of, you know, the housewife, right? It's still expected within our societies that, you know, women take care of the household, the kids and whatnot, which materially makes it impossible for them to have the same conditions of participation within society than men, right? What I tried to do is apply this idea specifically within a farming context, and there we're making the link again with the Italian experience, but that was way before the Italian experience. And I try to see how these types of institutions that prevent people from participating within society are also found in different types, of course, but also found within a farming context, right? And in that context, well, it's very easy to see how you know, alternative farming networks are going to suffer from certain institutionalized rules that prevent them from actually playing a role within society, or a big enough role within society to sort of change things for the better, right? And so I tried to apply her idea of recognition within that context. And I try to do so as well as she does, on pair with the idea of distribution, because the idea is not to say, well, distribution is incomplete, so we ditch it, right? It's to say, well, it still plays a role. And I mean, especially in farming, you know, Skander mentioned it, where does the money come from, right? I mean, making a living, having, having financial means, not just to, you know, participate in Fraser's sense, but also just to survive, basically, is obviously part of the story. So this issue of distribution is still very important. And Fraser says that it's, you know, it's both these issues at the same time that we have to look at, right? And it's not one of the other, like other people would say, like, you know, in our discussions with Axel Honneth, where he's going to say that, you know, recognition, for example, is this sort of moral grammar of social struggle, whereas she's going to say, well, no, it's a bit of both, right? And so I like that sort of balance between these two realities that was so obvious for me in the context, in this farming context in which I was working.
Yeah, and one of the words that you just mentioned, we can find in one of the articles that you wrote back in 2016 called "Justice and Conservation: The Need to Incorporate Recognition," um, which argues a point that's increasingly present in academia, which is the of justice in conservation in general, but through the lens of this really specific word that you just used, recognition. Um, Maybe for those of us who are unfamiliar with like how that word recognition fits into this context, can you tell us a little bit about how the two interact?
Yeah. So recognition, in simple terms, is about recognizing the right to be different, basically. It's about how we deal with difference within society, and how that difference, whether it's chosen or not, is going to impact the way in which we interact. I'm simplifying, but that's basically what it comes down to, right? And so the idea of including recognition is going to look at how people relate in different ways to the environment, and how that is going to impact the way in which we try and conserve it, right? When you think of it, the very idea of what is worth protecting of the environment in the first place is culturally driven, right? The history of environmental conservation around, big wilderness areas in the US, for example, was very related to one particular experience of the environment, one way of relating to the environment. And this is what the environmental justice movement is going to criticize, actually, that it's a sort of very sort of white male middle class type of experience.
We have to conquer the
exactly.
environment.
And so looking at recognition sort of helps us break that open, right? It helps us go beyond the sort of distributive distributive approach that we were talking about.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I love that you brought up that the kind of different realities of that. That's something that I've been reading a bit in part because I've had to with my course, but also because I am genuinely interested in it as well. Just this, like you said, the patriarchal kind of American like frontier mindset of the wild nature as like this like beast almost to be tamed, to be like gone into and conquered. And there is, I mean, even honestly a kind of like a sexual element to it as well. I think personally of like this nature as a thing, like almost you can find it almost to be feminized by men in like literature and stuff, as this thing to be conquered, almost like they think a woman should be conquered. And it's true that like when you read about that kind of mindset, and also the mindset of like pristine nature and stuff to be protected and such, kind of like it's present in a lot of other writings about women as being pristine creatures whose virginity must be protected, etc., etc. Like these kind of views, I think it's really easy then to understand how these views would come completely in shock with other views from, for example, indigenous groups, or just from honestly in a lot of other places in the world, and how that that kind of like that hierarchy where we've put the former as the mainstream way of seeing nature is could be very dangerous for the others. In terms of another article that you also helped write, which was about the role of indigenous people and local communities in equitable conservation. I was wondering, because the article makes quite a strong claim, and I think you have about it as well, saying that it gives kind of proof that the conservation is best done by people living in the actual space. Could you maybe tell us a bit about this concept and what the paper's proof is?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, a lot of my initial work was in applying sort of an environmental justice approach to conservation, to biodiversity conservation, either locally or more sort of conceptually around, what conservation means and how it's sort of evolved over time. And one of the recent papers that you just mentioned in Ecology and Society actually came out of a project that I'm running. It's called Just Conservation. The idea of that project is to understand how issues of justice and equity are sort of translated within conservation practice. Basically, how do practitioners basically transform these concepts, maybe without calling it that, right? They're not necessarily talking about environmental justice, but there's issues of rights, there's issues of recognition, there's issues of local knowledge being used or not. And that's, all of that can sort of be analyzed through a sort of environmental justice lens. And so this first paper that came out of that project is the one you're mentioning. And the argument we make is based on existing work. This is not, we didn't go in the field, it's not empirical work. We didn't go and do field work. This is actually like
a meta study.
Yeah, a review project. Actually, we're
Okay.
not collecting new data. We're using existing data that is out there. So this paper is based on, I don't know how much it was, but initially it was a couple thousand papers that we worked down to, I think it was 150, something like that. Basically looking at the impact of conservation, of community-led conservation on both the environment. Obviously, you want your conservation projects to have a positive impact on the environment, but also on well-being. And the point was in having these sort of this dual look, right? Both these elements. And when you look at both these elements and you compare it, you sort of cross-analyze it with who is actually driving the projects, you notice that when local communities are in charge or are actively participating within the conservation project, then the likeliness of achieving a more positive outcome is much higher than when you have external actors pushing it. That doesn't mean that everything is positive or that everything is negative with external actors, but it has a tendency of being much more positive on both these elements combined than when you have external players come into the picture. And so this is quite, I mean, it confirms a lot of existing research. It's not revolutionary in that sense. There was a lot of arguments in the literature on this. But what it does, it confirms these arguments. And what we added to it is we tried to understand why that was. So the second part of the paper is sort of tracing the different pathways, the governance pathways, we call them, in which local people, local communities, indigenous people are being included or excluded from the process. Well, typically one of these pathways is market-based instruments, right? Market-based instruments have this tendency of using forms of governance that are based on the idea of compensation. We're talking about distribution. Well, this is a very good example of a distributive tool, right? A distributive approach. So they're trying to balance, they're trying to deal with the trade-off between environmental well-being by throwing money at it, basically, right? We're going to compensate the community for, I don't know, the fact that they can't access the forest anymore because we're trying to protect the forest. And so they can't access the resources anymore. And instead we're going to give them money.
They have iPads. They have their Meta, headsets. They can go into the metaverse.
You don't even have to take it that far, but, in theory, it's not that bad of an idea, right? Okay, you're going to compensate them for something that they have lost. And what we show is that it doesn't work. right? It's this idea that hasn't worked. It's a failed promise of what they call benefit sharing within a conservation practice, in which the benefit is shared between those who conserve the environment or the forest and the local community. But also this it's not just the effect of these compensation mechanisms, it's also the very ideal that on which they're based. It's the idea that to conserve the forest, to continue with that example, you have to exclude it from the local community. You have to exclude the local community from accessing the forest, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of mainstream conservation is still driven by that sort of idea where you necessarily have a tension between local people and the environment. That the way in which local people and the way in which indigenous people live is necessarily a sort of threat to the environment, and that we, the sort of implicit message is that we Westerners with our, sort of ecologic and natural sciences know better, right? And that is, these different pathways sort of give part of the picture on why that is. Because when we actually put local people in charge, we're going beyond these we're departing from these sort of narratives that frankly have been quite destructive for conservation over time.
Yeah, and I mean, it must be a little bit difficult to evaluate metrics like participation from local people, because I keep thinking back often to this case of the Wet'suwet'en struggle in British Columbia, which we talked about in a bit more detail last episode with Sakshi. But the Wet'suwet'en are in a position where the company, fossil fuel companies, TC Energy, which is trying to push a methane gas pipeline under the river that they kind of base their whole culture around. That company is saying, well, we're working with local people. We're doing this the right way. We have spoken and gotten the agreement from from every single band council, which are representatives elected by these indigenous peoples. Now, on the surface, that seems like it could be qualified as working with local people, but then if you dig a little bit deeper, you see that those structures of band councils of representatives were stem from a history of Canada trying to push this representative system onto the indigenous people, forcing them to elect people, even though they have a very clear hierarchical system that they've been using for centuries, which, whatever our opinions are on that, I think that, we can fight for them to change that on another kind of level, but we have to respect the fact that they have that on this level. I think it's two different fights. But what I mean is that there's also been reports that these band councils are pressured by the companies, that people have been told by their elders, just take any deal, the best deal you can get, because you can't win against the white man's company. So these band councils aren't as it's not as simple as, oh yeah, they represent the local community. So I'm wondering, how do those kind of nuances fit into the metrics of your study, for example?
Yeah. Before getting into that, this very good book by Glenn Coulthard, an indigenous scholar in Canada. It's called Red Skin, White Mask, in reference to Frantz Fanon's book, where he's basically building a critique of liberal forms of recognition, like you find them very strongly in Canada, where there's this, at least in the discourse, this idea where you have to include minorities within government organized processes, and Coulthard is going to show how that is going to completely transform the way in which indigenous people are, experiencing their own land or their environment, the relation they have with the environment and whatnot. So
thank you for that.
People interested in that, I can recommend that book. To answer your question, it's the way we got around that is that we did a qualitative study. In that sense, it's not a meta-analysis. We're not in the sort of strict sense of the word. We're not doing statistics. We're not doing zeros and one would be they're included and zero is they're not included. Instead, we go into the papers and we look at the details of how they're reported by or documented by the authors of the studies we've included within our study. And we look at, we include obviously papers that give us enough information about how the governance process is organized. And then we have to make a judgment about whether it qualifies actually as a positive example of local people being in charge, or whether it's a more sort of, participation washing from that are very, very common in these types of setting, as the example you have given shows. And the ones that we kept as being examples of through participation, if I can say it like that, is the ones where we could be sure that there was that local people were playing an active role in defining and in implementing the conservation project that the study was talking about. And everything that wasn't actually an active participation in either defining the objectives or implementing the project was considered to be outside of that scope, was supposed to be a situation in which local communities weren't participating, or were participating to an extent where they didn't have enough influence on the project. And we can do this because we have this qualitative approach, and then we dive into the studies and to look at the actual details of the study, rather than try to simplify a whole bunch of studies around participation and conservation.
Yeah. I don't. Sorry, Jamie. I know I've been speaking a lot. But do you have? I don't know if you want the floor, I can leave it to. I just have one more question though. One of the things that we spoke about on an earlier call that we had, you and I, Brendan, was there's a kind of like methodology in which environmental justice is being studied in the global north based on cases of the global south. Do you think that this opens up the field of environmental justice to glaring issues? And do you think that this could potentially change as well with the numbers of like extractive conflicts, environmental conflicts happening more and more in the global north, as we see like in, for example, Canada, which we've mentioned, but throughout Europe as well, as for example, Europe is realizing that a lot of its rare earth minerals come from China, and so it wants its kind of geopolitical power back in a sense. Do you think, and also as more and more researchers are highlighted in global south areas, do you think that this is like a bad thing, and do you think that this is changing?
So your question about whether environmental justice analysis is going to become more important?
Well, whether there is something kind of insidious in a sense about this like global north studying the global south kind of.
If we're talking about more studies looking into the overlap between social justice and environmental exploitation, then I think that's a good thing. We want more studies on that, right? We want to, especially outside of the US, because the US has a tremendous amount of empirical evidence on that. We need evidence on that outside of the US, but we need to do so with analytical frameworks and concepts that are adapted to local particularities, right? We need to have frameworks that make sense within a context, whether it's the global south or other places outside of the US. One of the things where this is happening right now is in Europe, right? Environmental justice is becoming a thing in Europe. 40, 50 years after the US, but it's becoming a thing. The problem is that it's becoming a thing in a sense that is quite disconnected from the origins of environmental justice as a movement grounded within the lived experience of racial minorities in the US, right? And in the sense that, I mean, we can understand that like I was saying, the racial history in Europe is completely different from what we have in the US, and therefore, people don't really know what to do with it, I guess. The problem is of course that you're going to completely ditch the sort of more radical and political aspects of the environmental justice framework by doing that, right? Mm-hmm. And at the same time, you have within the sort of traditional environmental justice universe, studies, framework, whatever, a call now from environmental justice scholars to sort of break open the original framework, right? To make it, to open it to other influences, right? To for a long time we had this discussion about distribution and recognition that we had here as well. Now there's calls to go beyond that and open it to more thoroughly to critical race theory, to intersectionality, to ecofeminism, to decolonial theory, to all of these sort of influences that could potentially to political ecology. We talked about political ecology, mm-hmm. that could potentially add different dimension and help us sort of transform the framework into something that works in other places, right? Mm-hmm. It's been fairly common, like I was saying, it's been fairly commonly used within the context of the global South. There's a whole a team in Barcelona that is very strongly involved in that with someone like Juan Martinez Alier, the environmentalism of the poor, mm-hmm. That has successfully applied the framework, or this idea at least, within the global South. And there's been lots of studies after his work in trying to make sense of Southern environmentalism through this idea of environmental justice, right? This now needs to sort of happen within other contexts, and in Europe, this is going to be a long struggle, because you have the sort of weight of European social and political theory in a way that is both an advantage to helping us expand the concepts, but at the same time is a barrier to opening up to other ways of looking at the world, basically. And that's one of the things that I've been working on in the last years, is trying to understand how do we build a European sort of environmental justice.
Oh, it's Jamie. Yeah, Jamie, you're back. Oh,
yeah, hello.
You were frozen for a second. Oh, man, we seem to have a lot of internet issues today. Sorry about that. Can you say something, Jamie? Because I could still hear you very cut off. Okay. Yeah. Lagging slightly, but should be okay. So yeah, a European environmental justice. Do you see that like entering the higher level of global governance or European governance? Because that's kind of something that I guess worries a lot of academics or just activists, researchers, is that while these ideas often prosper at the kind of citizen level, they don't often or at least they take a while sometimes to reach the higher stratas of of our political leaders, and in the meantime, while they're kind of like traveling up, if they even are sometimes, other ideas seem to kind of get a lot of pushing. Like, for example, there's been this 30 by 30 initiative of like 30%, if I understood it correctly, And remember it, right? It is 30% of the world's should be like conserved area or something by 2030. And this like 30 by 30 super catchy like idea, for a lot of people who weren't very familiar with environmental justice or conservation justice, sounds like a grand idea. I mean, amazing. Yeah, let's push for it. Like 30% of the world conserved. That's awesome. We'll help to save so much of nature. And then and these ideas are like at the top tiers of governance, but they're obviously flawed in the sense that they don't take into account at all these ideas of conservation and environmental justice. So how do we deal with that kind of lag of the honestly more like the more nuanced ideas coming up the pipeline, let's say, or sometimes, like I said, not even coming up at all?
I'd just like to piggyback onto that question. Would you think it would be feasible that farmers at the ground level could sort of participate in that campaigning to actually get these this movement sort of officially recognized, or like actually get policy going with it?
Yeah, the interesting thing about environmental justice in Europe is that it actually comes from or it develops in a much more top-down approach than the one in the US, right? Okay. So in the US, like I said, you have this sort of, African-American community-led movement that, is going to push this all the way to the White House, right? The Biden administration has created an environmental justice task force recently, and it's been taken out by the Environmental Protection Agency, and Bill Clinton back in the days had an environmental justice bill signed and whatnot. So they were very, very effective in building up from the ground up, right? Mm-hmm. We can talk about the effects and whether it led to more justice. That's a different story, but it was really, sort of a bottom-up initiative. What we see in Europe is that we don't have something similar. We don't have an environmental justice movement in the US, in Europe. Even the word or the concept environmental justice isn't really present in public debate on the environment in general, right? What is coming up though is climate justice very, very strongly, right? But even climate justice, climate justice appears much later. It appears in the very late 90s, is sort of picked up within the more sort of international NGO world, is initially at least more concerned about sort of north-south relations, where typically those countries are least responsible for climate change will be the most affected or the most quickly affected by climate change. Typically, the global south is less responsible for climate change, but will face the consequences quicker and harder than the global north, on top of having less means to adapt to climate change. Mm-hmm. So you have this very sort of international focus, global focus, whereas the US movement was much more of a local sort of micro level focus, right? And that then sort of trickled down in a way to the movement level in a way. You still can't talk of an environmental or climate justice movement as such in Europe, but that's the origin. Right, climate justice was included in 2015. Was included in the discussions on the Paris Agreement, for example, and that's basically when it exploded. That's before that, there was very little talk outside of the more expert groups and academics and whatnot about climate justice. And then in 2015, you have this Paris Agreement. And then a couple of years later, you have all these sort of youth-led movements. You had Greta Thunberg, you had, the Fridays for Future, you had Extinction Rebellion that all of a sudden talk about climate justice. Unlike sort of traditional NGOs, these movements weren't necessarily putting, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions first. Obviously, that's part of the story.
Mm-hmm.
But the call now is for climate justice. We want to have climate justice. Now, it's never really defined, and it's never really clear what it means.
Mm-hmm.
But it's been picked up by these movements and really, brought. Well, I'm not saying back to life because it didn't exist before, but it's been used as a sort of master frame now, up to a point where even, the more traditional NGOs like Greenpeace and whatnot also started talking about climate justice.
Yeah.
So there's been a sort of dialectics between a sort of top-down approach and a bottom-up approach in Europe on the concept of climate justice. There was sort of interestingly, in a way, co-opted by the movements to say, okay, this is our concept, and we're going to actually use it. We're not going to leave it to the sort of policy-led circles, UN level type of approach. We're actually going to claim it for us. And it's the movements that sort of made it a popular term that you can now hear on TV by journalists being used, et cetera, et cetera. So is there a danger of co-optation like you have seen with other terms, like sustainable development and green something, green economies and whatnot?
Net zero.
There always is, obviously. But I like to think that justice is a bit too radical to be co-opted in a way. It always has this sort of radical edge to it that never really gets, completely absorbed within a sort of policy environment, or could not be absorbed within a policy environment. And one of the interesting stories about that in the US was actually that when the Environmental Protection Agency started looking into these issues, they actually created a bureau or an office, or I don't know what it was called, on environmental equity. So they created, while the environmental justice movement was booming, basically, they created an office of environmental equity. Because that was their way of trying to get a more political aspect of the movement, of trying eliminating that, right? That didn't really work, and there was a lot of protest, and eventually they changed it to an environmental justice office in the end. But so it shows you how the term justice is sort of attached to a whole set of principles, and a way of and a form of activism in a way that, in my view, isn't as easily co-opted as would a term like sustainable development, which from the start was obviously more easily useful for policymakers and of all kinds.
I'm wondering, sort of, how do you build a sort of, I don't know, citizen or something that largely involves citizens or farmers? What sort of qualities? It's a very open question, but I guess, like, how do you design its sort of culture of the movement to be against being co-opted, or to be cautious against being assimilated by a different group that wants to warp it in an alternative direction?
Well, I'm a scholar, so I'm going to respond as a scholar, and what my role in that can be. But I think is in part in Europe, it's about building evidence on environmental inequalities that right now in Europe is completely patchy or inconsistent. There's no sort of there's no there's no analytical frameworks that address the issue at a sort of cross European scale, right? So we have no means of reading the situation at a European level and actually building the evidence that movements are going to use to fight their battles, basically. If we look at the US, what happened in the US, there was a sort of combination between the bottom up movement, the grassroots movement around these things, qualities by environmental justice colors. And the movement was using advances within academia, from researchers to reinforce their demands, showing like, look, this is the actual evidence. Our communities are facing disproportionate exposure to, a whole set of environmental risk, right? And that doesn't happen currently in Europe because we don't have that evidence, right? Basically, if you're an activist, you have nothing to go to. If you want to lobby or if you want to criticize a policy, or you don't have the data, the necessary data to back up what you're saying, right? And I think in the US, part of that movement has been, structured around building a lot of evidence, and actually they have so much evidence on these things. So that's the first thing that I want to work on, and that's in a way my way of supporting the movement. But to answer your question more precisely, I think when you do that, it's inevitably going to show that certain communities, certain parts of the population, certain people are disproportionately exposed. And the more you show that, the less it can be co-opted by policymakers, because those who are faced with these environmental consequences would only their case would only grow stronger in a way, right? That doesn't make the movement stronger, obviously, but the case they can build on becomes stronger and stronger, right? And that's, it's an incomplete answer, and there's no magic bullet, and I've no idea how you avoid being co-opted as a movement or even a concept, or how we avoid concepts being co-opted. But my answer would be that continuously putting the justice of environmental justice back where it belongs, and reminding everyone that environmental conservation or environmental governments or any form of policy in favor of the environment should be about justice first and foremost.
Yeah, and I think as we start to wrap up slowly, I do want to give a shout out to shout out of your book, Environmental Justice: Key Issues, which is a really a comprehensive textbook about all the kind of topics that we've talked about so far. Do you have it on hand? Yeah, there you go.
It's always on my desk.
And I have to say, I love the cover art as well. That's pretty fantastic.
It took me a while to find that cover.
Yeah.
It was quite a discussion with Routledge on what cover we're going to choose.
Yeah, I can imagine. It must be hard to just summarize environmental justice with one picture. That also makes it so people want to pick up the book. But yeah, you guys have done a good job on that.
Thanks.
Would you say that the what would you say makes this book unique? Because that's kind of one of the I guess selling points of the book, and it seems to be aimed at kind of university students, but also people who just have a general interest in it. I mean, after all, it is a textbook, but also potentially people who just have a general interest in the topic. How is it different from other environmental justice books that have kind of been published?
Well, to answer that, let me sort of run you through how the book came to be, because that's how I framed it. So the initial idea of the book started when I was finishing my PhD, and I was starting to teach. With students, and increasingly I had students come to me for papers and dissertations and whatnot, coursework in general, on environmental justice, because that's what I was teaching. So I was basically opening doors for them, like, this is what I would like you to work on, but I was always sort of struggling to give them something that, one, was accessible for them, considering that, I teach only in English, but I work with non-native speakers. My students are mostly French students, so they needed to have something that was accessible, that was written for them, and something that was going to give them a fairly broad overview of what environmental justice studies was, but not in a 600-page book that costs 200 euros, like the Routledge handbooks, for example, right? And while I was looking around, there's lots of books on environmental justice, lots of them, right? And they're all great. They're not all great, but many of them are great. But when I was giving them to students, it was way too much work for them to sort of dig through the whole literature. It was a proper barrier for them to sort of get going with this concept of environmental justice, because they had to read up so much before they could actually start applying it and working with the concept in the context of a course paper, right?
Yeah.
And so I was looking for a textbook that didn't exist, right? There wasn't. There was one textbook, but it was fairly old, and it wasn't really. It was a reader. It wasn't a textbook. It was a reader, and it was already like 15 years old or something. So I basically reached out to Routledge and told them, how about we build? The initial idea was a dictionary on environmental justice. How about we build a dictionary on environmental justice? Like, we have the keywords, and we have a sort of extended definition of keywords, like a page per word or something, on the main concepts of environmental justice. And then Routledge said, we don't know, that sort of things doesn't really sell well and whatnot, but we could turn this around, and how about we do something a more sort of, it wasn't a textbook at first, but something more accessible on environmental justice, which they didn't have in their collection. Yeah. And this is how the idea of a textbook was born. And so the difference with other books is it talks to students first, obviously not just students. And I think the fact that it's, that we paid a lot of attention to it being very accessible makes it accessible for other people outside of academia, outside of students that would be interested in environmental justice, obviously. But it's really organized as a textbook that you would expect, the sort of questions at the start on what students can expect from the text, and then at the end it has this sort of, well, not questions at the start, but bullet points, sort of, the highlights of the chapter. And then at the end, you have follow-up questions, and you have tips on, what to read next. And you have the way in which the chapters are organized is all, sort of a coherent whole of, you can actually read through the different chapters and build up your knowledge of environmental justice. And we added pictures to this. The whole thing was thought as a tool for learning. So that's what I think makes it different. And also it's it's cheap compared to the Routledge handbooks.
Yeah, I was gonna say, how did you manage to get them to
well,
that was
a point from the start, but Routledge was fairly open on that, and it's in one of their series that is called Key Issues in Environment and Sustainability, where the prices are kept fairly low. Because it's the target audience is students, so I don't know how much it is, like 25 euros or something. You can get the book, so which was important for me, right? I can't tell my students to read the book if it's 150 euros, right? Like these academics, right? So that's sort of how it came to be. And I think that this, to add to that, what I wanted to do as well is, as part of this thing that I work on trying to expand the idea of environmental justice, on trying to, diversify it. I wanted that book to also open up to other ways, less common ways of looking at environmental justice. So not just distribution, recognition, participation, but I also asked a colleague to, develop chapter on decolonial theory. I asked colleagues in Barcelona to work on a chapter on degrowth and environmental justice. I added a chapter on ecological justice, on sort of more than human forms of justice, because justice is always, well, not always, but very often framed within a sort of very anthropocentric kind of approach, right? There's a chapter on intersectionality. There's a chapter on critical environmental justice approaches. So I tried to, break it open as much as I could as well, but still staying within this initial objective of making it very understandable and making it very useful for students.
Yeah, that's a fantastic project. Where can people find the book?
You have a link on my website or just on the Routledge, Routledge website. You can just type environmental justice. It's one of the first things that comes up. So.
Yeah. All right. I think if Jamie, do you have any other questions you'd like to ask?
No, I've asked all my questions.
No? Check the list. All right. Yeah, I mean, it has been an hour and a half, so I think we'll have to wrap it up here. But we could definitely talk to you for much, much longer about this. Brendan Coolsaet, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for sharing
you very much.
Your wisdom and your knowledge. And yeah, we definitely look forward to seeing more of your influence on these fields that we've talked about, because it definitely seems like you have quite a critical mind about this. And it's exciting to see. So yeah, thank you for your work.
Thank you for your time. Thanks for having me, and keep up the good work. I mean, I've been going through your podcast list, and it looks great. I have to say, it looks great. So keep up the good work.
Well, if you have any suggestions for who we should have on the show, we're always open to that. I mean, this year is going to be, I think we're going to be churning out episodes, like we said, and so yeah, we're always on the lookout for quality speakers, and so maybe even some of the colleagues that you worked on with on the book, stuff like that. Definitely be interested.
Yeah.
And before we sign off, though, I just wanted to, because I know that a lot of our kind of viewers are mostly academics and such. There is a conference that you are, I think, in part leading, and there was like an open call for papers or abstracts. Do you maybe want to shout that out, or also maybe you can shout out where people can find you as well? Oh no! Oh, there he goes back. Oh, this internet. I don't know if you heard what I said. No. Okay. No.
Something about a conference.
Yes. I was just saying that a lot of our viewers are in academia or like researchers as well and such. And I saw that there was a conference on global governance, I think, that you are part of. Or that you were at least sharing around. Is that something that you're like working in, or was that just sharing?
I think what you're mentioning is the call for papers that I'm organizing with a colleague, Stasha Ryder, on what we call a transatlantic dialogue on environmental justice.
Yes.
It's a panel we're organizing as part of a conference, the annual conference of the Earth System Governance Network, which is basically the biggest social science network in the context of environmental studies. And their next conference is in Toronto in Canada next October. And we wanted to do something around this tension that I talked about earlier in the show, between the need to adapt to local context and the willingness to sort of, acknowledge the origins of environmental justice. So we want to try and explore that tension by having dialogues between people that work on, both sides of the pond on these issues. Well, it can be broader, of course, than these two sides, but that's what we want to do. So if people here are interested and are hearing this and want to contribute, our deadline has just been extended with another 2 weeks. So
nice.
Feel free to send me an abstract.
Also, October Toronto is. I'm literally in Toronto in October. It's going to be the first. Yes, I'm going to potentially for my research, but also to see one of my oldest friends. And I've only ever been to Canada once before or something, so it's going to be great to go back.
Let's do a show in person then.
Yeah, let's do it. Maybe I can just walk around the conference with a camera and a mic and just interview people. That would be fantastic. But yeah, and where can people reach you, Brendan, as well, if they have any questions, if they want to, I don't know, see more of your stuff?
I guess the easiest is my website, brendan.coolsaet.eu. Contact details are in there. All my publications are there. So I'm on Twitter. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
That's yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much, Brendan. And yeah, maybe see you in Toronto.
All right. Thank you, guys.
All right. Take
care.
care.
Have a good one. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.